conference after what I hope was a very good lunch for you. I'm sorry we're starting slightly later than planned. We will continue until just after 4 o'clock. Now, for the next hour and a bit, we are going to look at global developments in both onshore and offshore wind. And the Turkish Wind Energy Association, TÜREB, have asked me to set the scene by just saying a few words. I won't speak for very long. I will now show you some pictures. This is what wind energy looks like in Europe today. The blue bars are the gigawatt installed in every country, and the red bars are the share of wind in every country's electricity mix. You can see that Denmark, and we're going to be hearing from the Danish embassy shortly, in Denmark, wind is now 44% of all of the electricity they consume. Look at those figures on the left-hand side. We have over 180 gigawatts of wind installed now, but only 16 gigawatts of it so far is offshore. The vast majority continues to be onshore, and of course, wind is now 12% of electricity in Europe. This is the magical slide of Dr. Fatih Birol, which shows that wind energy, the red curve, is going to be the #1 source of electricity in Europe soon after 2025. And you can see the evolution here of all the other sources of energy. This is the responsibility we have in our sector, ladies and gentlemen, for carrying the rest of the burden of electricity supply in Europe on our shoulders. Now, cost reduction. This is the trend in auction results for onshore wind in Europe over the last 5 years. And you can see we've recorded the results of the Turkish auction here. In fact, the lowest results so far. A slight uptick perhaps in the last year or two, but the trend is very consistent. And we see a very similar trend for auction prices in offshore wind. There we are. Now, this is the most important slide I want to share with you. The yellow at the top is the range of the costs of offshore wind. It's between 60 and 90 euros a megawatt hour in Europe. The blue, which overlaps a bit with the yellow in the middle there, is the range for the costs of onshore wind. It's between 30 and 65, 70 euros a megawatt hour. And the red curve is what we would normally expect in any year now to be the trend in average wholesale electricity prices in Europe. And the message from this chart is very simple. The revenue we're getting from that variable wholesale price, sometimes it's enough to cover our costs. Sometimes it even covers the costs of doing offshore. But most of the time, it is not covering our costs. Most of the time, there is a gap, and something has to fill that gap. And this is why auctions are so crucial. It's why YEKA, YEKDEN are so important to the further expansion of wind here in Turkey. They provide that gap of revenue, and above all, they provide stable revenues. Because look at the wholesale price, it's extremely variable. And what investors want is the perspective of having stable revenues. That then helps reduce the costs of financing a wind farm. Corporate PPAs, power purchase agreements, are helping to fill that gap as well. Wind farms are now able to sign 15-year agreements with Google, with the chemicals industry, with aluminium, and they will buy electricity from the wind farm for 15 years or more at a fixed price. And look how rapidly these corporate PPAs are growing in Europe today. And these are the sort of sectors, cement, paper, chemicals, steel, that are now looking to sign these corporate power purchase agreements. I won't say much about floating because we have panelists who know much more about offshore wind than I do, but I do want to show you this. Look at the sea depths. Red is sea depths up to 50 meters. Yellow is deeper than 50 meters, and then green and blue are even deeper. As you can see, the red in the North Sea is where we're building fixed bottom offshore wind today. The yellow we can only do floating, and the green and the blue we can only do floating. So if we look at the waters around Turkey, you have huge potential for offshore wind, but it is likely long term that much of it will be floating as opposed to having it all fixed bottom. Finally, and then I will give the floor to our eminent panelists, ladies and gentlemen, can I do some advertising? This is the next annual Wind Europe event. Many of you came to Hamburg this September. Next year we're going to Spain. We're going to be in Bilbao on the 2nd, 3rd and 4th of April. It will be both onshore and offshore wind. It'll be a great conference, a great exhibition as ever. Here's the Guggenheim Museum. Many of you will be familiar with that in Bilbao. We can promise you an excellent time as and when you come and join us next year in Bilbao. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. Now, I'm going to start introducing the proper speakers to you. And first, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you the Managing Director of Enercon in Turkey, Mr. Arif Günyar. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Günyar.
Teşekkürler Sayın Başkan.
Thank you, distinguished chair, moderator. I actually prepared my presentation in English, but I actually will be delivering it in English, in Turkish. So thank you very much, first of all. Now, from the side of a turbine manufacturer, especially with regards to developments in the world, about the auction systems that we discussed about, the prices, about the costs, and with regards to turbine manufacturers, from this perspective, what we'll be discussing. Now, actually, Giles already provided us the same thing. Actually, we're speaking about the wind energy, 3.6% of a share overall for the use of energy, I mean at the side of energy share. And in the electricity generation, it is 8.7% of a share that we have. Well, in particular, between the years 2016 and 17, for that is the per terabyte hour of a change in electricity generation and from the renewables. And between 2010 and 2016, especially this part, I mean, is actually getting the biggest of the share from also the wind. And between 2019 to 40, I mean, by 2040, according to the scenario, again, the share of all renewables and total power generation will reach to 40%. It's an increasing trend, and especially solar will be doubled. We'll have such a share. And in wind also, we are actually having an increase. Now, over the selected regions or over different countries, again, this is the electricity demand. Mainly will be by China, United States, India, and of course on the other side, the European Union countries as well having such an electricity demand. And mainly by 2017 up to 2040, again, the Chinese market and the India market will actually have a huge growth. These are our expectations, and in particular, European Union and the United States, these two markets at the same time, will actually have a slowdown in terms of the growth. Of course, renewable energy source not used actually for electricity also will be used for heating at the same time for transport as well. And especially in transport and heat, the share will continue to increase. And looking at the other sectors, especially for the buildings in the industry and in the households, again, use of electricity and, of course, use of electricity as a source of energy. Here, these are some of the prospects, and especially it is actually going to be much more prominent than the fossil fuels. Of course, in transport in particular, we don't have such a quite high level, especially oil sources are much more dominant, but still, for e-mobility, especially in e-transport, electricity will actually have a good share. And on the other hand, we also have, from the legislation perspective, the Kyoto Protocol and all, so as to reduce carbon dioxide emission. Again, use of renewables will always be at the top. And in particular, in the upcoming period, as you can check the graph on the right bottom, in terms of carbon emissions, especially the green scenario in particular is actually much more realistic. Of course, as a manufacturer, yes, there is actually increasing demand for electricity, and in particular in the main scenario in here, electric cars, use of electric cars especially will be more, especially the markets in China and India will be more in need of energy as a part of their growth. And of course, at the same time, we have Africa, which is actually an untouched land. There also will be more energy demand. And therefore, as manufacturers, producers, I guess it means that we also have to change our way to the other markets as well. So, of course, here from the International Energy Agency, by 2040, that's the electric car fleet will be up to 300 million. And therefore, in terms of the energy sources, again, the rules will be changing. So, specific to the wind energy, in 2017, 52.5 gigawatt of installed capacity, and cumulatively 504 gigawatt installed capacity that we can speak about. And in which continents we have this installed capacity? Again, by region, Asia, mainly China on the forefront. Besides that, Europe and North America. But on the other hand, at the same time, Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific region, and the Pacific side of Asia, we also expect some growth, as I show from the other slides. These are actually untouched virgin lanes that we have to go. So that's actually the market forecast for the upcoming years. 2018 to 2019 again actually will be up to 8, and up to 2020 this growth will slightly decrease, and by 2021 there will be a decrease in growth, and after 2021 again in the wind energy market again there will be a regrowth in the installed capacity, but not an extreme growth, probably not more than 10% or in that range at the global scale. So in terms of growth, again, that is the Asian market. As you can see, will have the largest share for the market forecasts, and North America and Europe. It actually will contribute to the growth. And as you can see on the table, especially Pacific and Africa, also we expect a growth. Well, of course, we will have new markets, speaking about the Asian market, the African market, and also from this perspective, there, of course, will be some changes and new developments, so we have to make a proper assessment of this. Of course, we have the political and country risk as a part of the risk assessment. We have legal risk, technical risk, and organizational risk. And of course, in total, that's a commercial risk. And as a turbine manufacturer, of course, one by one, on country-specific basis and project-specific basis, we assess them. That's the risk map for 2018 in terms of security and politics. And the new markets that I'm speaking about, they actually bear a risk. In particular, looking at this map, and more importantly, it's actually very important to get prepared for this. That's pretty obvious from this risk map. And of course, looking at the rating of the country, whether we are bankable or not, of course, the risk is lower for a country with a high rate. Of course, the wind energy market is already settled in there, so countries with high risk are actually new markets to us. And of course, it's going to be a challenging period to us. Of course, from this perspective, what you have to pay attention in risk assessment is the type of the contracts, what type of contract we should have, especially a contract conforming to the international codes. It should be an international standards, EPC or X-Works. Is it good for the local regulations? Of course, from technical point of view, whether we have electrical conformity, especially grid codes, or, for example, frequency of the grid is mostly 50 hertz, for example, Japan, 60 hertz, or especially from electrical point of view, we have to check about the suitability of our turbines, which requires some time and some R&D work. From geographical point of view, transportation route, or some geographical structure, speaking about Africa, in particular in North Africa, actually we have deserts, and especially as the design and everything should be considered, or on mountains, especially in places with less airway. And in terms of suitability of the turbine there, and for transportation, we have to consider this meteorological conformity, again, whether it's good with IEC wind class, icing, extreme heat, or sandstorms, especially Egypt projects, for example, and whether these turbines will survive under these conditions or not. You have to consider that. And likewise, especially in the new markets, manpower, whether we have qualified manpower or not, especially transportation, crane. Of course, we have to check whether we have this availability or not, because once you offer a contract, you actually have to consider them all. On the other hand, besides the turbine, especially in the European market or in Turkey, I mean, in terms of EPC, I mean, not only turbine, but when you assume the entire project work, whether it is going to be possible to apply the same in the new countries or not, and also in terms of credit worthiness by banks. Again, we actually have to consider them all. So from legislative perspective, we also should consider, for example, health and safety at work issue, and everything should be considered. In terms of commercial risks, for example, a turbine manufacturer coming from the Eurozone, the countries that we are going to work with, we have to check for their currency exchange risks and check whether they can be financed or not, and consider the potential risks. And production and supply chain, and especially is another point for risk assessment, the local content criteria, especially Turkey, for example, South Africa, Brazil. In these types of countries, again, because if we want them to be production centers, then we have to make long-term strategic plans. And of course, financing and insurance. Again, it's very important to have projects that can be financed. Here you can see, I'm sure my colleagues will mention more in details, but looking at the auctions 2017 and 18, especially price levels reduced a lot. Over the euro, in particular in Turkey, 28 euros. In Morocco, 24, in Mexico, 15, in Brazil, 17 euros. So, of course, conditions are different in each and every country. I mean, it's not like comparing apples with apples, of course, but in general, the price-related risks at the same time should be considered, and of course, the overall problems in the market. And in 2010, in total, 1,843,000 capex cost is now 1.477 per megawatt, and the capacity factor is almost at the same level, especially you actually have to consider also the areas there for wind. And on the other hand, levelized cost of electricity. Looking at this KPI, again, $6 per cent. Of course, the rotor diameter of the turbines are also getting larger, and almost 100 meters and over. I mean, or for those 100 meters and under, especially European markets cannot actually accept it. So it's also diameter is increasing. For country-specific capacity factors, especially with more blade size and also increasing the power. So the capacity factor, as you can see, is increasing. I think one thing to keep in mind in here is that between 2010 and 16, looking at the capacity factors, especially in Turkey, the turbines in Turkey, especially the newly used ones, the capacity factor, I can say, is as such an increase here. Here is the statistics, and for both megawatts and the rotor size, where the trends are going, especially America, Europe, and Asian markets. Looking at the orders received in 2008, the majority of those in the States, American, and mostly 2 megawatt turbines, followed by 3 megawatt turbines. And in Europe, this is a bit different. Mainly 4 megawatt. These are the announced orders, but 3 megawatt orders are still at the top. In Asia, 2 megawatt mainly considered. In terms of the rotor size, it is 126 to 125. That is the most favorable or the most popular ones, according to the orders announced. And of course, for 2018 up to 2023 in the American continent, 4 megawatt and 3 megawatt turbines are more ordered. I mean, probably the order will be more. And for the European market, mainly 3 megawatts and partially 4 megawatt will increase. And so it's actually much more dominant. So until 2023, in 2022, in the forecasted new product introductions, again 4 megawatt will be actually introduced more in Europe by 28%, 5 megawatts and over. Will mainly be introduced, and for Asia, 3 megawatt turbines will be more on the forefront. From this perspective, as a turbine manufacturer, yes, of course, looking at the cost factor, for 5 megawatt and over, and 170 meters and over, again, there will be new turbines to come by 2021. We're working on it. Of course, it's a really rapidly emerging market, and in terms of the life cycle of the turbines, it's actually will be reduced. The life cycle assumptions are shorter, especially due to the cost factor. That actually have a negative impact. I think we don't have time, so I will skip those. Don't worry, Giles, I'll skip. So one thing here, that's the first half of 2018, especially for the quoted turbine manufacturers. When compared to 2017, you can see the turnovers, and there's a reduction. And over 50% of a reduction, especially on the side of the turbine manufacturers. We're not so happy about this, especially trying to catch up with the market conditions, and the cost factor is so aggressive. So last part, how we get prepared for the new upcoming years. Especially you can see at the field of energy generation and storage that we have. We actually have turbines in 50 countries with a worldwide company and 60 gigawatt cumulative installed capacity that we have so far, and 44 sales offices that we have worldwide. And more importantly, especially in terms of the supply chain, just because of what I told you, we're just doing globalization at the same time paying attention to local content. In 7 countries, we are manufacturing different parts of the turbine, and especially at the global scale, we are manufacturing some of them, and especially in Turkey, we'll be working on, and there will be a generator, again, a factory will be made active. And that's how we'll be doing. And with Lagerwey, our Dutch origin company, we're cooperating. And again, we actually will have higher rotor size and will be included in our portfolio. Of course, in terms of use of energy and electricity, again, there'll be charging stations for the electric cars and for energy storage. We're still working on this, especially for electric cars, plus for storage purposes, or again, to use it from power to gas. In doing so, recently, in 2019, we have a project that will be launched, an island system. In the island system, and without connection to a transmission line, 2 cities in Germany and Netherlands will generate their own energy, electricity, and consume. And we don't have time, so I cannot get into the details, but if you wish, after the conference, for those who are interested, I will share it with you. Thank you for your attention.
For that. Ladies and gentlemen, now please welcome to the lectern Mr. Tuna Guven, who I suspect needs little introduction to most of you, member of the board of Tureb, of course, and deputy managing director of Borusan. Tuna, the floor is yours. Are you going to speak from the seat? Wherever you wish. Okay.
It's more comfortable for me to talk from here. Yeah, I need a clicker. So I'm gonna switch to Turkish. Okay, I started. Hoş geldiniz hepiniz. 2 güzel haberle başladı.
Welcome everyone. So we have 2 nice news and about the YK auction and capacity increases. Actually, I will divide my presentation in 2 parts. One is between 2005 and 2017 in Turkey and in Europe, where is the transition in installed capacity, and especially in wind and onshore was installed capacity. And in the second part, in the upcoming 5 years, what is going to be the case in Turkey and in Europe? I mean, whether we actually will reach our goal in 2027 or not. Now, so 20 gigawatt of installed capacity. It is 165 in Europe, in the world 520 gigawatts. And we don't have offshore, and it is, I mean, in us we don't have it, 16.9 in Europe, and worldwide 18.8 gigawatt. Therefore, the installed capacity in offshore, I can say, in Europe, of course, especially for onshore installed capacity, as you can see, we have the maximum in Germany, and followed by Spain, the second. China, I mean, in onshore, the total China is actually more than Europe in total. And America, United States, 89. I'm just giving the figures to tell you how is it in onshore. In offshore, again, UK, the first, Germany, the second, China. Denmark is actually also 1.3 gigawatt for offshore. And therefore, from macro perspective, with regards, that's the size in terms of wind. Now, in Turkey, between 2005 and 17, what's actually the change? I mean, 38.8 gigawatt from 2005, 85.6 gigawatt in 2017. So in 2005, from hydro, natural gas, and coal and fuel oil, that's the total mix at that time. I mean, they were dominant, as you can see. I mean, solar, wind is almost none. In 2017, this time, I mean, relatively, I mean, as you can see, especially coal and fuel oil is reduced, it's replaced by solar and wind. And in 2005, including hydro, I can say this share of the renewables increased up to 46%. And in 2017, in Europe, at the same time, especially the share of renewables around 46%. And therefore, I can say it's actually an installed energy mix that we can speak about in Turkey. Now, in Europe, again, 676 gigawatt total installed capacity. And in 2017, 938 gigawatts. And nuclear that we have in Europe, which is actually quite a huge portion. Coal, gas. This is also dominant in 2005. But wind is actually 41 gigawatt. It's included in this. Solar, too. And for 2017, this time, again, the share of renewables around 46, increased up to 46. I mean, it was 25% in 2005 when we had them all on the top. And therefore, the coal and fuel oil is reduced. Of course, gas is actually much more prominent, but it's replaced by actually solar and wind. Of course, biomass also has a role in here. Therefore, between 2005 and 2017, also in Europe, there is actually a change trend similar to Turkey. I mean, like a transformation to the renewables. And, of course, quite a huge increase in the share of wind. Of course, that is what we have in hand. And speaking about the upcoming 5 years, of course, there are different projections in here. And thank you very much for team of Giles in terms of these projections. They've really done nice things and they shared good data with us. And maybe the most important thing in here is that in the upcoming 5 years, I mean, which auctions will be performed? I mean, what the schedule will be for the auctions? I think that it's very important to understand the general trend. That's went from Wind Europe, and in 2017, that's indicated auction and tender calendar. I mean, maybe not possible to see such a crowded slide, but you can have access on the internet. But the message that I'm trying to give in here is that starting by 2018 up to 2022, 52 gigawatts of tender calendar already announced by all European countries. So we in Turkey, 1.2 gigawatt offshore. I guess it will be in auction, and for onshore next March, and 2 gigawatt of a capacity by April 2020, and therefore probably in the upcoming period with regards to our market, that's all that we can have. And now in 2022, the Wind Europe for the installed capacity of Turkey will be 250 gigawatt for Europe, and 253 for Europe, 10.1 for Turkey. I mean, I will talk to Giles over lunch, and I mean, once we have an auction for one power plant, and from the time that it's commercialized, it's 3 years in Europe. In Turkey, thank you, Ebru, by the way, for the detailed calculation, 4.4 years the entire process takes. Therefore, this 4.4, whether it's long or not, rather than having such a discussion, there's actually a phase difference. I mean, the quantity that you have the auction for is actually larger. I mean, so you make a stock. maybe it would be nice to have an indicative auction calendar, so it provides us with some predictability. And if you're asking, it's very important for sustainability. Check this out for Germany, never down 3 gigawatts every year. I mean, they have an auction each year. By the way, in Europe, the other issue that we have is that until 2020, for the renewable targets already achieved in wind as well. So up to 2030, 32% of renewable, I mean, the target for electricity generation from the renewables by that percent. There's a National Energy and Climate Program that they have, and that's such a planning that they will be announcing after 2020. And I think it is these policies that we will understand. I mean, once they actually highlight, underline these issues, probably 253 gigawatts of an installed capacity that we'll get in Europe.
So within the 5 years to come, the situation in Europe and Turkey will be like this. So now coming back to Turkey, the very basic topic of the Turkish Wind Energy Congress, we have around 7 gigabytes of installed power according to the reports of the Turkish Wind Energy Association. And our target is 17 gigawatts. According to a report, a guide that is published by the Energy Ministry, and in different policy documents, different targets were mentioned in the past in Turkey. But I'm sure they've been working on this, because a single target is very important for the whole ecosystem, for the wind sector in Turkey. Because when we say the Turkish wind energy ecosystem is not consisting solely of investors. There are component manufacturers, survey firms, turbine manufacturers, transporting firms, construction firms, subcontractors. So a single target would be very good for all the actors in the sector to have a single goal. On the other hand, the targets are decreasing actually one by one. In the first strategy document in 2020 up to 2023, it was 20 gigawatts. Now it's 16 gigawatts actually. The updated target is. How are we going to reach this? By commissioning 1 gigawatt each year, we can reach 16 gigawatts. I think it's realistic. I think it's achievable. Because in 2015 and 16, we commissioned more than 1 gigawatts of capacity. So I think for Turkey, it's a goal that can be achieved. And now, let me talk about our rates of commissioning. The total licenses given into 2012 and before is around 4 gigawatts in total. 99% of them have already been commissioned. These are also in the reports published by our association. And there are also some cancellations as well among these tenders listed here. And we have 7 gigawatts of installed capacity. So we can say that in the Turkish ecosystem, we have a ratio of 60% and 40% stock. So after this period of 4.4 years that I mentioned, then we can commission these. And in 2011, the auctioned capacity is around 64 wind power plants, and for these 64 wind power plants, the average period is 4.4 years, and the average is 60%, as I mentioned. Therefore, in the future, we should be auctioning 8 or 9 gigawatts more than the 16 gigawatt of targeted capacity. This way, in order for us to reach 16 gigawatts of capacity by 2023 with the current structure of the Turkish market, this is what we should be doing. We should be auctioning 8 gigawatts higher than our target. It is also important to note that when should these tenders or auctions take place for the 7-8 extra gigawatts? In the next 3 to 4 years, we should be auctioning them so that also if we add 4.4 years, then we can reach the target of 16 gigawatts.
Çok kısa bir özet yapmam gerekirse aslında
To make a very brief summary about Turkey's success story, in order to maintain our success story in Turkey, there are a few important points. One of them is the price policy after 2020 in Turkey. The second one is that in all policy documents there should be a single target. It is 16 gigawatts now and target of commissioning 1 gigawatts per year. Another important topic, these 64 power plants that we mentioned are distributed among more than 40 firms. So these medium-scale investors are also very important. It was also mentioned during the first session in the morning that if we hold the tenders by 50 megawatt lots rather than larger lots, then medium and small-scale investors can also be included. Another important topic is the duration period between application and auction tender. The last time we received the application in 2015 and the auction was in 2017. It was a good duration, not very long. I think we should continue this way. Another important aspect is that foreseeability is important for sustainability. Therefore, we should have regular auctions at regular intervals and we should be publishing them. Thank you very much. I think we will be able to reach our targets this way.
Now we're going to move specifically on to offshore wind, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to introduce to you the Managing Director of the German Offshore Wind Foundation, Dr. Andreas Wagner. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Wagner.
Thank you very much, Giles. Very kind, even though I haven't made my PhD yet. I'm just a master of political science, but I really appreciate being here for the second time after 15 years, I think. I was back then with EWEA here in Ankara at some of the very first wind workshops. And now I'm back in a role with the German Offshore Wind Foundation, and I've been asked to talk about the development in Germany. Giles mentioned already the European development, so I will have only 1 or 2 slides at the end about the European perspectives. To start with, why are we going offshore, first of all? Some might ask, you have huge potential onshore in Turkey and other places, but that's the question. And then I wanted to dive a bit deeper into the German market development and also the legal framework for offshore wind that we've gone through in Germany, because I think, as mentioned before, Germany is number 2 after the UK, and we've also learned our lessons well, and it took some time to achieve this number 2 situation. First of all, to introduce our own association, it's a non-profit trust, a non-profit organization promoting offshore wind in Germany since 2005. We were created actually with the support of the German Ministry of Environment at that time, who was developing an offshore strategy back in 2002 already, but in 2005, when the foundation was created, there was not a single offshore wind farm in German waters. And there was a call from the industry to set up a test site, a demo project to get offshore going. That's what we have done in the first place, and apart from that, we've been acting as a communication platform, policy platform, to communicate about offshore wind benefits for all the key stakeholders from the industry, but also the policymakers. You can see here who is in our board of trustees. So we have also the relevant ministries in charge on the federal and state level, but also the developers, the manufacturers, supply chain, banks and financiers, and other trade associations. So this gives us a very specific role in the German trade associations sector. So why offshore wind? There was some talk this morning about offshore wind in Turkey, but I just wanted to highlight some of the key benefits and just to bring back a little, put it all into perspective. If you look at the global picture, you can see that the global coastline is about 350,000 kilometers, and that's about the distance from the Earth to the Moon. So we have a vast potential, 40% of the world population living in coastal areas, and they are consuming more and more energy. Almost 200 countries have, or 150 of 200 countries have access to the shore. So that's a huge potential for offshore wind, and you can see also where the lights are, that's mainly also in coastal areas. So that's very positive. And why offshore wind now? I think the key is the levelized cost of energy has been coming down dramatically. I will go into that a bit more deeper later. Second important factor, it brings employment like onshore wind, but also for the maritime sector, which is very important for shipyards and the whole maritime service companies. Of course, it brings environmental impact with CO2 reduction and also benefits actually for the marine life. And in the end, and most importantly maybe, at least for European standards, offshore wind can deliver energy system benefits because of the very high full load hours in the range of 50% and more capacity factors that we have seen for offshore wind farm, and therefore that's almost kind of baseload power that we can contribute with offshore wind. Now diving a bit more into the German situation. Germany has been a late starter compared to Denmark, which we will hear later, and also to the UK or the Netherlands. We did a first step at the end of last decade with setting up a maritime spatial plan for offshore wind and for all uses of the sea. And you can see the red dots on the map. Not sure, yeah, it doesn't work. These are the areas designated for offshore wind. The blue areas are shipping lanes. Then we have some green areas. 1/3 of the German North Sea and the Baltic Sea is designated for nature protection, so it's taboo, no-go areas for offshore wind, at least in Germany. So we have crowded space, and the government needs to designate some space for offshore wind to identify the best locations. So that was a very important prerequisite that was made at the end of last decade in Germany. And then the second precondition is, of course, the legal framework for offshore wind and the incentives, feed-in tariff system that we have seen in Germany for all renewables since 2000. That went very well, but for offshore wind, it didn't work until the reform of the EEG law in 2008, when the tariff for offshore wind was increased, because at that time offshore wind had higher cost, and there was a specific regime introduced that was adjusted in 2011 and 14. I don't want to go into details, but you find it all in the on the records, in the proceedings. There was also some digressive components built in this feed-in tariff, and you see that we had also some ambitious targets. 10 years ago, the government set a target of 10 gigawatts for offshore wind by 2020. By 2030, 25 gigawatts. Unfortunately, I must say, 4 years ago, this was cut back to 6.5, respectively 15 gigawatts by 2030, due to allegedly higher cost at that time. But it was mentioned by the Deputy Minister also this morning. It's also a question of time when you look at the resource and the technologies, and now we've gone a very fast way in reducing the cost for offshore wind. Last year or 2 years ago, a new law was introduced, the Wind at Sea law with the EEG 2017, that introduced an auction regime for the very first time in Germany. It set up a new trajectory for offshore wind also during the 2020s. And I don't go into details, but I prefer to show you the results. Before, also some learning curve and lesson from the German legal framework development. We've gone through a lot of system changes in the legal framework for offshore wind, including the grid connection regime. There were at least 4 or 5 major reforms in the last 10 years or so that led to some ups and downs and some concerns in market confidence among the investors. So I can only reaffirm what the previous speakers have said. We need a clear visibility and a reliable legal framework. If we come now to the real market development of offshore wind and also the outlook in Germany, then I should highlight that we just started 10 years ago with a pioneering project. My president always calls it Germany's moon landing project, Alpha Ventus, which is a test site that was started construction actually 10 years ago only and was commissioned in 2010. Only 8 years ago. It was really a landmark project in terms of distance to the shore, 60 kilometers offshore, water depth 30 meters at that time. That was really deep, so you couldn't work with monopiles. We had to apply jacket structure or tripod installation. 2 different types of turbines, 5 megawatt turbines for the very first time had been installed. Now we're talking about onshore 5 megawatts coming up, but that was really novel at that time, and it was also done by a consortium of 3 utilities who shared the risk of this pioneering project. The results were very positive. We have seen capacity factor exceeding 50%, so 4,500 full load hours almost, and the whole thing was accompanied by a very ambitious research and development program funded by the federal government. So 60 megawatt project that produced in the first 4 years of operation more than 1 terawatt hour of electricity. That shows the capacity that's behind offshore wind. And then after Alpha Ventus 2010, you can see that was the starting point. Development accelerated until it peaked actually in 2015 when we had installed 2.3 gigawatts of new capacity that went online to the German grid, also caused by some delays with connecting some of the offshore wind farms. It's the TSO in Germany who is responsible for connecting offshore wind farms to the main grid, and now we are in the range of 1.5 gigawatts additional capacity each year. So that's very positive. This is the German seas, the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, the picture of 2014. Only 4 years ago, we had about 1 gigawatt online offshore capacity. 1 year later, it was more than 3 gigawatts. And if you look at this slide, only the green dots, these are all wind farms that are in operation, 20 projects fully connecting to the grid, more than 5.4 gigawatts operational, 5 more projects under operation, and 2 have a feed-in final investment decision. So we are progressing very well. This is the detailed statistics, and this shows you the picture where we're heading to. 2020, as I mentioned, is the target 6.5 gigawatts plus an additional buffer that was foreseen of 1.2 gigawatts, total of 7.7, which we are very confident to come close or reach. That's the maximum possible capacity that was awarded by 2020. By 2025, we've seen 2 auction rounds this year and last year. We will see probably close to 11 gigawatts. This again is the legal framework. Since last year, we have 2 auctions, as I mentioned, and I just wanted to show you the results because there was also a paradigm shift that we have seen last year. For the very first time, 3 out of 4 projects that were awarded bid with 0 support. So there was so-called 0 bids that will be built towards the mid of the next decade. So by 24, 25, they are expected to go online. One from EnBW, the largest project actually with 900 megawatt that goes online by 25. So in 7 years, still a long way to go. And I will show you what's the reasoning behind these 0 bids. There are some reasons listed here. I don't go into detail, but you can look it up afterwards. But I have highlighted some more here. That's a slide you have seen, or a similar one you have seen before. These are some results in other European markets. You can see a clear downward trend in the range of 50, 60, 70, 90 euros per megawatt hour at the most, depending on the year of commissioning and the size of the project. The strike prices also vary a little bit. But what's very important, what's lying behind these 0 bids is, one, the assumptions in technology development. So the developers, the winning bidders, are expecting turbines to go beyond 10 megawatts rated capacity in the range of 13 to 15 megawatts by the mid-2020s. And thereby, of course, the balance of plant costs would reduce. This is an illustration of this increasing trend of the turbines we have seen over the past and projections to the future. And also the project size has increased dramatically. We are seeing now offshore wind farm projects in the size of a nuclear power plant with 1 gigawatt or more of rated capacity. And that has also a major effect of bringing the costs down. So this is also very important. And the final special situation in Germany, we have seen very low wholesale electricity prices in the past few years in Germany, as low as 30 cents per kilowatt hour, or even below 30 euro per megawatt hour. They are projected to increase because Germany is phasing out nuclear power by 2022. So we will lose 10% of our electricity production in the next 5 years. And we also have a plan, or it's right now being discussed, to reduce substantially coal by 2030. There is talk about at least 50% coal generation phase out, and by the end of the 30s, even by the mid-30s, the total phase out of coal generation in Germany. We will see the results of a commission by the end of this year or early next year, and that will also have an impact on rising wholesale prices. So to sum up, I think the drop in auction results across Europe, but especially in Germany with the 0 bids, reflected the growing maturity of this still quite young offshore wind industry. That's why we as a German industry, we also calling for the German government to raise the target up to 20 gigawatts by 2030 and to 30 gigawatts by 2035. Because we need that capacity if we want to electrify the other energy sectors like transport and heating and cooling sectors, like Gunyal was showing in his presentation. I think that's a clear requirement, and therefore offshore can be the kind of base of a future sustainable energy system. Final slides. Offshore wind in Europe, you've seen that. Just putting it in a perspective, Germany has 1/3 of total European capacity, with the UK about half of installed capacity by the end of last year. And this is the global picture. If we take even a longer term view, up to 2050, IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, is expecting more than 500 gigawatts of offshore capacity, and we're seeing right now already many new emerging markets outside of Europe, US, China, Taiwan. Taiwan is also a very good example at the moment, pushing offshore wind very much, and with plans to add 5 gigawatts by 2025. So maybe it could serve as a role model for Turkey. If the Turkish government is really committed, take a look at Taiwan, what they are doing there, and I'm sure you will have a similar progress than the colleagues are doing there. Finally, some lessons learned from the German developments and maybe some key takeaways that Turkey can make. So we need a clear planning and permitting process, very streamlined. We need long-term visibility that's also connected with realistic and reliable targets, and we need clear revenue stabilization mechanisms, and especially at the beginning, some kind of more generous incentives compared to more mature markets. And then in the end, you will also get local supply chain and skills developed over time if you provide this clear long-term visibility and pipeline of projects. With that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the final discussion.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Now, finally, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the lectern Dennis Holterskov Albertsen, who is counselor in the Danish Embassy to Turkey, responsible for energy, environment, research, and innovation. Dennis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Giles. Moving from Germany, we go slightly north. I think we kept going north, apart from Giles at the beginning. Kind of started off very north. But anyway, I'm very pleased to be here at the 7th Congress. I've been here in Turkey for 3 years now, so I've been able to follow kind of a lot of the development going on. In the light of the good cooperation there is between Denmark and Turkey, I'll get back to that later, the details of that. I'm very pleased to tell something about the offshore experience we have in Denmark. We have quite a long experience in offshore energy. Actually, we got the longest of any country in the world. I think this year was the decommissioning of the first offshore wind park, which was actually put up in 1991. It also says something about the longevity of offshore that we didn't know when it was put up. The reason why we went into wind energy to begin with was actually in the 70s because of the oil crisis. That was onshore wind that we started thinking about. And then later in the 1990s, we then started to think about offshore. It's also because Denmark is very small, so we don't have that much land, and also we have a very long coastline. The development in offshore, and especially in offshore wind, has really has led onto a world record, which we actually set in 2015, which was about 48% of all our electricity came from wind. That number is going to rise to about 60%, close to 60% in 2020. So that's, and we have only been able to do that because we have developed the wind sector in a very consistent manner, trying to remove risk and also do very consistent planning, which is something that the investors like. Also, we have, going forward, we have a new energy agreement signed this year, which also is something very Danish, is that all the parties in parliament actually agreed to this, which means it doesn't matter which government comes from now on, the plan is set. And that's another thing that investors like. In that plan, there is 3 additional offshore wind parks of each 800 megawatts planned. When it comes to planning, it's important that the government in the country, when you do offshore wind, and this is actually not just for offshore wind, you could take this for all wind. It's really important that you consider 25 years forward. You don't just consider, like most politicians sadly do, 4 years forward or 5 years forward, because that's what they're elected for. But it's important you have an institutional engagement going the whole way through. you could say that the key instrumental factors that we used in Denmark is a robust maritime spatial planning. It's also something touched upon a little bit by Andreas in the previous presentation, which is it's also an EU requirement, as far as I know, that maritime spatial planning, not just for wind energy, but for other activities in the maritime environment. Also a streamlined consenting process, which is really important. And then also an integrated and focused de-risking approach. I'll say more about what that is. When we talk about planning in Denmark, what we do is that we put together a committee, which is actually a spatial planning committee, which was established, I think, first time in 1995. And this is to get the parties together, led by the Danish Energy Agency, to talk about all the issues related to maritime spatial planning. It's important that you get all the institutions around the same desk to talk about the constraints at sea, and also to find out where are the most suitable sites for offshore wind. It's also, and this, you can see on the slides, the number of institutions actually included in this. It's also quite important that at the bottom of the list you also see the wind industry and R&D institutes are also involved. So that's really important. And this committee really ensures coordinated development, which also has a link to the electricity grid, which is really important. Then one other thing that we really would recommend other countries to also consider is to develop what comes closest to a one-stop shop, which is rather than having to run around to a lot of institutions to get different permits, have one point of entry. And that's what we have done in Denmark. I should also say that all the things that I'm presenting is not, of course, not something we have developed at the very beginning. This is a result of the experience that we've had over the last 25 years. So you don't jump from A to Z, you kind of take some steps in between. The one-stop shop is really that the Danish Energy Agency is the single point of entry for all investors. And they then communicate with the other institutions, the other ministries which are relevant. It could be the Ministry of Defense, it could be the Ministry of Environment, it could also be the TSO, or is the TSO. On the slide you can see an example of how that process goes. The Danish Energy Agency is in charge of the whole planning, the tendering and the consenting process. And it also means that the investors really don't carry the big consenting risk, which is something they like as well. And this has also led to low bid prices, which is always should be the incentive for all politicians and for all people from the industry. And it also means that it reduces the risk perceived in the development of the projects. And I would say in a country like, or in the market like the Turkish one at the moment, I think that is specifically interesting and relevant. See if I can find my notes for the next slide. Yeah. What we've learned in Denmark is that you have to take a systematic approach, and you have to think long term, and then you could create a cost competitive framework. But you really have to make sure you don't change the rules too often. Of course, you have to adapt when the market changes, but really don't take a zigzag road. What we also done in Denmark, we really have a tender model which we call kind of front-loaded, which means almost all the permits and all the tests that are done related to offshore wind tender are done before the actual tender, which also means that when the investors have to consider to bid, they know the whole story. They don't have to look at this black book and say, okay, we are not sure about the risk, because you know the risk up front. It also means that there is a fixed feed-in tariff for the first 12 to 14 years. Actually, it's set in 50,000 full load hours, which normally means about 12 to 14 years. That also means that there is a shortened time between the tender award and the start of construction. So you actually go online quite quickly after the tender. The other thing I also want to mention, and this is, I know, something that the Turkish government doesn't agree with, is the local content question. In Denmark, the last 25 years have showed that if you open up for the best technology from around the world, you will achieve the lowest energy prices. The other thing as well is that if you do open up for no local content rules, you will make your own industry competitive, which also will mean that your industry will be competitive and can be exporters to other countries, which then can create extra jobs in Turkey, for instance. So that's the thing. There are many views on that, but that is how we prefer to do it in Denmark. And I should also say that most of the offshore wind farms which are built in Denmark, if you look at the percentage of local content, it's actually very high. The last thing, or one of the last things that I want to say as well is that what is important is to have the stable political framework conditions and then the strong market-based competition between companies. And then therefore you promote the entrepreneurship and R&D. And then you have an ongoing dialogue with the companies who are likely to bid. It's important to get their feedback through the process. And also having one point of entry, the Danish Energy Agency, is easier to gather those input that you get. I should also say that one evidence of this leading to lower prices was in 2016 we had a tender for the 600 megawatts Kriegers Flak project, and the price at that point, which at that point was a world record, was 49.9 euros per megawatt hours. That's excluding grid expenses. So you can say these experiences that we had in Denmark over the last 25 years, we feel are very relevant for Turkey to have a look at. You can never copy, and you should never copy a model from one country directly to the other one, because there are local conditions which are unique. So again, if you look at Denmark in its composition and its history and the energy history, it's very different from the Turkish one. But I think it makes sense to look at aspects of it. Ooh, went too far. One thing I want to mention at the end as well is that we are actually working together, closely together with a Turkish government at the moment. We have two so-called strategic sector cooperation projects, which are technical projects where technical experts from the two countries work together. It's from the Danish Energy Agency and the Turkish Ministry of Energy. One project is ongoing. It's about heating, which has been going on for about 2 years. And in these days, we're actually starting up offshore cooperation program. So this is something we are looking very much forward to. And I should say that I have here with me today also 2 colleagues from the Danish Energy Agency, and we're going to be around for the next 2 days, or these 2 days. So don't hesitate to come and approach us and give us any input you might feel is relevant in our work going forward. Thank you very much.
The opportunity, if I may. Do I have the permission of the chairman, Mustafa Bey, to give the audience the opportunity to ask some questions or make some comments? Do we have a microphone available? I hope we do. Yes, would anybody like to ask a question or make a comment?
I will support.
You will?
No, if you want.
You will support that we open this up to the audience now, Mustafa, yes? Okay, very good. So the floor is yours, ladies and gentlemen.
Evet, sorusu olan var mı?
Any questions?
Elleri göremiyoruz.
Raise your hands if you have any questions, please.
I see a hand at the back there.
Great.
Yes.
Keep it up.
Hemen ulaştıralım.
Hello. I'd like to ask the other panelists if they agree on the comment from the Danish Chancellor about the local content.
Very good question. So, would you like to go first as the turbine manufacturer?
Local content, I mean, I just passed the question, but is it what I'm thinking about the local content generally, or yes. Is that? Yes, I mean, okay, I mean, if you're talking about Turkey, it's very simple to answer because, I mean, we have started in Turkey to produce in 2001, 2002, and we're in very early stage. And as I have shown, we are producing in a lot of countries as Brazil, Portugal, Sweden, etc. So, especially because of the cost, local content or local production is very, very important to reduce the cost. But on the other side, we have to think about the financing, since I mean the percentage of the Turkish components is good to reduce the cost, especially for the transportation. But it makes no sense if we have no subsidy to finance, to have the finance for the Turkish or local produced components, because for now, it's as German manufacturer, Hermes conditions are much more attractive than the Turkish banks, what we are seeing now. That's why we are seeing that our clients or customers are also focused on the turbines or on the components which are produced in European Union, because they are preferring that sometimes because of the financing. So the subsidy for the local production maybe should be increased, or there should be another subsidy, because for now it's because of financing it's not attractive enough. But anyway, it's a new trend worldwide with the local production, and we have to decide as manufacturer which countries especially should be the hub for us, because we cannot produce in each country. It's not possible. And therefore it's the governments are asked for really attractive subsidies for the manufacturer.
Okay, thank you, Arif. Dennis, what does the Danish government think of local content rules?
I think what we think is that we don't think it's necessary, because the market powers will do the job for us. I should also say that especially I think the local content rules we don't think make sense when you start up a new market, because then the supply chain is not there yet. So I think I can understand, as I said, you shouldn't copy one-to-one what other countries are doing. We just see that if you open up, especially when you open a new market like offshore in Turkey, if you open up for global supply line, the developers and the sub-suppliers will find the cheapest version, the cheapest alternative, and that also will lead to a cheapest prices. That will also lead to that they will look at everything they can get locally, naturally, because also the salary levels in Turkey will mean that if you want to put up, like Enercon, put up wind turbines, you will look at everything you can locally, if possible. And then later you can then look at, when the market is more mature, do you want to introduce some local content rules? But we have seen for 25 years, which I think is a pretty good statistical base, is that actually most of the content has come locally, even without local content rules. And also our industry in Denmark has become competitive globally without local content rules in Denmark. So it actually means that I think we have more jobs in the Danish wind sector working on projects abroad than we have in Denmark. I think it is the biggest export sector, energy technologies in Denmark. So it actually, you can earn money by building energy here, but you can earn even more if you make your industry competitive going abroad. And Turkey has an industry which is well equipped for it.
Thank you, Dennis. Andreas.
Yeah, I fully agree with Dennis, more or less, although I must say local content is important, of course, selling it to the politicians. But I would also like to say that, I mean, we have a similar experience in Germany with a sector that generated 160,000 jobs, 160, in the wind industry, and of that 27,000 jobs are in the offshore wind sector, in a sector that, as you saw, emerged only in the last 10 years. So that proves that without local content requirements, you can still generate a big number of jobs, provided that you have a stable legal framework, the sufficient incentives and a clear pipeline or targets where the government wants to go. And final word, I mentioned before Taiwan. That's the kind of emerging big offshore market. And they also have some local content requirements, but not for the very first projects. So the first 1 or 2 gigawatts, they are organized on a kind of free market regime with a fixed feed-in tariff, and then they are moving to an auction system with some local content specifications. I think once you have a base, then local content will come automatically.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. Are there any other questions from the floor? Yes, gentlemen here, and then we'll draw the proceedings to a close. Thank you, sir.
Is it working? Yeah. First of all, thank you for everything, information you provided. My question is actually a little bit quite common, but I want to refer to Mr. Wagner's point, which is the Taiwan example. My question is that how the Turkey can convince the foreign investors from the major markets like European Union, rather than investing Taiwan, how they can, what Turkey should do to invest in Turkey rather than Taiwan. Because as the all panelists also mentioned, for example, Mr. Günyar mentioned that the legal and political risks. Also, Mr. Güven mentioned that the consistency and transparency issues. Then afterwards, the Chancellor Albertson gave an example of the conditions are different in every country. So it's like, I would like to ask like a common question, how Turkey specifically can convince the foreign investors from the major markets. Thank you.
Yeah.
Go on, Andreas, yes.
Yeah, if I may, I think it's quite easy. I tried to, in theory it's quite easy, but of course it requires a lot of political will and commitment in the end, and it took Taiwan, I think, 4 or 5 years of political debate to arrive there where they are now, including political decision to phase out nuclear power by the year 2025. So they need some extra alternative generation capacity, and they found the answer in offshore wind because of the high capacity factor offshore wind can generate. In Turkey, it's slightly different. You still have a growing energy demand. So, I mean, without phasing out nuclear power, I know there are plans for a big power plant. Without that, or without entering that debate, I think there is a lot of room for a larger pipeline for offshore wind. So visibility is key for the longer term, not only one auction for 1 gigawatt or something like that, but a pipeline at least up to 25 or better, even better 2030 with some smaller initial steps. So some smaller projects maybe at the very beginning with also some careful pre-assessment, site assessment, resource assessment that was also mentioned this morning by the panel. And then I think you can quickly go through the learning curve because the industry is much more mature than it was 10 years ago when we started in Germany, for example. So I think that would be my advice.
Indeed, Andreas, and thank you to you for your attention and your contributions to the discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm round of applause to our 4 panelists. And coffee and cakes are served outside.